Well, folks, welcome to part 7 of the How to Play Basic Impetus. Well, we just got done covering the movement section, and now we're going to kind of get into the mechanics of combat, shooting and close combat, retreats, pursuits, all the details on that good stuff. But first, in this part, what I'd like to cover is the basics of combat. And what that is, it's making damage rolls and cohesion tests, something we find in both melees and shooting attacks. I'd like to get into the basic mechanics of that and how they work. They are pretty simple and straightforward, but I want to cover that, get into some detail, and when we actually get into the nitty-gritty rules on shooting and close combat and the procedures and sequences that we follow to resolve those situations, we'll have a good idea of how they work if we talk about the damage rolls and cohesion tests that we have to make during those parts of the game. So that's what I'm going to focus on in this part. Damage rolls and cohesion tests. Well, one of the first things we need to address in Basic Impetus regarding combat is what is it and when does it occur during a battle? Well, the first thing to look at is there's basically two types of combat in Impetus. There's missile fire, missile attacks, shooting, etc. That's any unit that's equipped with a missile weapon, and that would be indicated in the army lists, like if a unit has bows or longbows or crossbows or slings, etc. They'll be capable of launching a missile attack against an enemy unit. So that's the first one. The second one is melee, or close combat, which is just about every unit in the game is capable of doing that. And when does that occur? Well, that occurs if you move during your activation into contact with an enemy unit, you will resolve a melee combat. It can also occur if you activate a unit that's already in contact with an enemy unit, in which case the melee would be resolved then and there. So that's when they occur, and that's the type of combats in Basic Impetus and Impetus in general. Now there's a couple things that are common between melee combats and missile combats that we should really understand from the get-go, and those two things are what's called the damage roll, or rolling for damage, and the cohesion test. And we're going to look at these two. First of all, the damage roll. Let's look at that. What does it represent? Well, basically your damage roll is a roll you make to determine how effective your unit's attack is, whether it's in melee or shooting. It's a representation of how intense, you could say, the attack was, or the potential it has for routing or destroying and doing permanent losses to the enemy unit. That's really what it represents. The damage that you roll out of this and that you get out of it, it isn't permanent. It's just a representation of that particular attack and becomes the basis for determining actual damage and results later on in that attack. How does it work? Well, let's see. If you go to your Army lists, you'll see a statistic for every unit. It's called VBU, and that stands for Basic Unit Value. And that is the basis for determining your damage roll. The higher the number, the better, and it represents the number of dice you're going to be rolling to resolve the damage. For instance, if the unit had a VBU of 4, that would mean you roll 4d6, 4 dice, to resolve the damage roll. Now, once you have that number, you're going to go to various modifiers, tactical, weapon type in the case of shooting, and situational, etc. And we'll get into those details when we get into the combat and shooting sections, but it's enough to know that there are modifiers to your VBU, to your damage rolls. Now, once you know how many dice you're going to be rolling in a damage roll, what do we need? Well, it's really easy to remember. And it's the same for shooting and melee. You need 6s or you need double 5s. And each 6 and each double 5 equates to 1 point of damage inflicted on the enemy. Now remember, these damage points aren't permanent. They're just a reflection for that attack of how much potential damage you will do. And we'll get into that when we cover the cohesion test. But yeah, that's what you're looking for. So if we take an example, say we got a melee attack over here. We got some heavy cav, and they're going against some heavy foot. Well, let's say they have a VBU of, 5. Let's say they get a modifier of +1 to that. They have a 6. They're going to be rolling 6 dice, and they're going to be looking for 5s, double 5s, and 6s. And if we look at that roll there, I got a 5 and another 5. I also got another 5, and I got a 6 and a 6. Now, this third 5 would be discounted, as would this 2, because what we're after is double 5s. Each one equals 1 damage. The 6s each represent 1 damage. So here's another one. So what we got with that roll was 1, 2, 3 damage points on the enemy unit. That's how that basically works. Now, some other things we need to keep in mind with the damage roll is that through modifiers, you can get a negative result. In other words, you might end up rolling no dice at all because you're at -1 or 0 or whatever. Now, in shooting, that's important to note because it means your attack is totally ineffective. But let's remember this now. In melee, no matter the negative modifier, if you're taking a 0 or less, you always roll at least 1 dice for your damage roll. So let's remember that. A second thing to remember is that in melee, both sides will be rolling their damage at the same time to resolve that single melee that's going on. As opposed to shooting, where it's just the shooter that's going to be making the damage roll and the target just basically sees if he can survive. So he doesn't make any rolls. But other than that, it's pretty much how it works. In melee and shooting, the damage roll is basically the same thing. The only thing really different is the modifiers that apply. So that, in a nutshell, is the damage roll. Now, the second thing we want to look at is the actual cohesion test. And this is done immediately after the damage roll, or the roll to see how much damage a unit received. If a unit receives no damage from an attack, then it does not have to make a cohesion roll. Okay, so get that out of the way. But otherwise, if it takes 1 or more damage, it has to make a cohesion test. And what is the test? Well, it's a D6 roll, and the results of that roll determine how many actual permanent losses, as they're called in the game, a unit receives from an attack. So you can see right away that a unit that takes a lot of damage could end up receiving a lot of permanent losses to itself. In addition, it could also rout a unit, and as we'll look at in the close combat section, as well as the shooting, a unit that's routed is removed from the table. And a rout is basically when a unit's VBU is taken to 0 or less. So the cohesion test is pretty critical. So how is that test made? Well, it's a D6 roll, and the first thing you want to do is you want to find the critical number. And this is a simple calculation. It's basically your current VBU of the unit that took the damage minus the amount of damage it just received. And that is the critical number. So for instance, say my current VBU for a unit was 4, and I just received 3 points of damage from an enemy attack. Quite substantial. My critical number would be 1. So it's as simple as that. Now, the modifiers to this roll, and they're very simple. There's only 2 of them. There's a -1 for disorder, and there's a +1 if the general is with the unit. In other words, it's attached to the unit. Those are the only modifiers to the cohesion test. Once you have this modified critical number, it's a value you have to roll on a D6 or less to pass. If you roll higher, you're considered to have failed the cohesion test. Now, let's read the differences here. If you pass the test, the only effect is that the unit becomes disordered. You don't suffer any permanent losses from the attack. You just become disordered. Now, if the unit is already disordered, what happens is that you keep your current disorder and you receive right off the bat 1 permanent loss. So you receive a 1 permanent loss for that. Now, if you fail the test, in other words, roll higher than your critical number, the difference between what you rolled and the critical number becomes the number of permanent losses your unit suffers. So for instance, let's say that my critical number was 2. Let's roll the dice and see what happens. I roll a 4. Well, the difference between my roll and my critical number is 2 points. I failed the test, and the difference is 2. That means that the unit I was testing for takes 2 points of permanent losses to its VBU, basically. And I would record that, and usually we use little markers. I use little micro dice for that. In my case, I would just turn this to a 2 and put that next to the unit to indicate that it has taken -2 to its current VBU. And in addition, you also become disordered. If you're already disordered, it doesn't really matter. You just keep the disorder. There's no additional permanent losses for that. Now, a couple more things we need to keep in mind regarding the cohesion test is if your critical number is 6 or higher, you automatically fail on a roll of a 6. Well, you fail on a roll of a 6 regardless. But if your critical number is a 6 or higher, and you do roll a 6, you automatically fail. And your loss, in this case, becomes a 1. So that's what would happen there. Now, if you roll a 1, you're automatically successful. And that's true for everybody. If you roll a 1 on your cohesion test, you automatically succeed. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that in melees, a unit that fails their cohesion test and took the most permanent losses to their VBU also must retreat. And again, we're going to cover that when we get to the melee section of the how-to. And one more thing to remember, and I think I've already said this, is that when a unit is taken to a VBU value of 0, it's routed. It's removed from the table. And that's how you destroy units. Take their VBU to 0 or less, and they're gone. So folks, that's cohesion and the damage rolls. That's how they work, basically. And when we get into the actual rules for shooting and close combat, we'll get into a little bit more detail on the cohesion test and the rolling for damage, specifically as it relates to shooting and close combat. Okay, folks, that pretty much concludes Part 7 to the How to Play Basic Impetus series. I hope it helped. I hope it gave you some grounding in how cohesion and damage rolls work. In the next part, Part 8, we're going to be going into depth on shooting, missile weapons, and how it all works in the game. Basically how you shoot and do some damage. So be prepared for that. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed. Any questions, be sure to message me. I'll talk to you guys real soon. Thanks a lot.